We are the higher self of the One, known in your language terms as Timothy, who started its physical incarnation sequence on this current timeline on the Earth planet on 1984 of the linear time-space nexus. We are now communicating with you in the love and light of the One Infinite Creator. And before we start to address the query placed by this instrument, we must understand and consider this, that we as the higher self of this entity are always concerned about preserving the free will that has been granted to each individualized portion of consciousness, the right to choose the type of experiences they would want to experience, and also the type of timelines they would want to enter into. We are now communicating from the sixth density of consciousness, the density of consciousness wherein there is no separation but only unity can be found. Furthermore, on your level of consciousness, there is but one error in disguise upon many people on the Earth planet. This is the unbalanced nature of the mind complex, which creates unwanted psychological suffering by creating unwanted and by projecting itself into the future timeline and creating imaginary sequences of things going wrong many a times. These lead to a unbalanced emotional charge inside the physical vehicle as a reaction to these imaginary sequences, and the fluidity nature of your reality is such that many a times these negative imaginal actions have a consequential reality or a reflection on the outside world. For the outside world is just a mirror reflection of the inner reality, which many entities will find this connection, and also the inner perception of the self leads many entities to understand their true nature, because each entity's true nature is diversified as the One, and this true nature must be remembered and understood as being the causal reality. Furthermore, many a times entities are also able to understand the connection of their own inner feelings with the outside reality, as their inner feelings will begin to reflect to the outside world this perception of more fluidity and more variable nature of consciousness, because entities are able to understand that if they approach a situation with love, they will be able to handle the perceptions of the other entities as well, as each entity is unified as the One. We shall now proceed with the sharing of one timeline only of the soul evolutionary cycle of this entity, known in your language terms as Timothy, who started its first density incarnation cycle after originating from the One Creator on the Arcturus star planet around 7 million years prior to this linear time-space. This entity was given the soul name of Yomana in the Arcturus language, which means the variable nature of consciousness. And in the beginning stages of the first density, it spent its incarnation in the form of the water element, learning to navigate the first density level of beingness and also learning to interact with other first density elements. During this level of consciousness, this entity, after learning many of the lessons of beingness, was able to sufficiently spend its time on this level, and it began to evolve and reached into the beginning stages of the second density, wherein it began to learn the lessons of that of experience similar to your plant life as found in your planets. After this middle second density and the later second density consciousness level, this entity began to resemble the animal life form, similar to the so-called dogs that are found on your planetary level. However, this occurred on the same star planets in which it had originated in. This entity then, after learning many of the lessons on this level, after 7,000 years and multiple cycles of incarnations later, was able to graduate into the beginning stages of the third density consciousness, which is the density of choice and the density of self-awareness. During this timeline, this entity began to become aware of the reality which surrounds it, and in the illusion complex, it began to face the catalyst, which allowed this entity to enter into the choice of either choosing the positive polarity or the negative polarity. This entity, however, in the beginning stages was dissuaded by some negatively influenced entities and was trying to manipulate this entity to enter into a negative polarity of service to others. We correct this instrument of service to self. Because of this manipulation, this entity known as Timothy spent the beginning two incarnations battling this choice of polarity of service to others and service to self because of exterior influences on the same planet of its origin. Furthermore, this entity, after attaining a level of the 8th sub-octave of the third density consciousness, this entity was then transported to the Earth's Atlantean complex, which had the opportunity to allow entities to reach into the higher sub-octaves of the third density and also allow entities the process of graduating into the fourth density beginning stages. This occurred around 75,000 years ago, when the lands of Atlantis existed on the Earth planet. The Atlantean civilization were advanced in nature, and they also had many aspects of spiritual understanding much higher than what is currently present on the Earth planet. This entity on the Atlantean complex spent this incarnation learning the lessons of spiritual awakening and the awakening of the Green Ray Energy Center. However, this entity was not able to fully polarize on this incarnation sequence, and after reaching into the later sub-octave of the third density, this entity, for the purpose of graduation after the destruction of the lands of Atlantis, this entity had taken part in the destruction of the lands of Atlantis also, and had gained some type of negative karma collected against its soul evolution. Hence, in order to repay this karmic collective, this entity was transported to the Earth's humanity collective in order to allow it to access the window of soul graduation along with the repayment of the previous karma collected, the opportunities for which were presented in the first incarnation, which began on the timeline of 1625, and it was given the soul name of Fabana. In the form of a woman body complex, it spent the basic incarnation sequence in a physical vehicle of undesirable nature, which led the physical vehicles to then enter into the later stages. And this entity crossed over on the timeline of 1660 after learning many of the lessons. After soul healing, it reincarnated into another timeline on the time and space of 1720, with the main purpose of this incarnation being that of reaching a polarity of higher service to other aspect. On this level of consciousness, this entity spent a major part of this incarnation learning to balance its lower chakras of the red ray, the orange ray and the yellow ray energy centers, which need to be balanced by each entity. For each entity will have the opportunity of using this balanced energy center aspect to rise into higher levels. This entity then crossed over on the timeline of 1800 and took on the next incarnation cycle after reincarnating on the timeline of 1865 in the form of a woman body complex known by the name of Edith. On this level of consciousness, it was able to understand the lessons of balance between service to others and service to self aspect, because this balance is a necessity for entities who desire to reach into higher sub-octaves of the third density, as well as have the opportunity and the chance to graduate. This entity was able to balance these aspects and spent the major part of this incarnation as a so-called teacher entity, teaching the other entities to become more service to others oriented, which made this entity extremely positively polarized. And it crossed over on the timeline of 1927 after suffering from a disease known as fever, after which this entity reincarnated into this current timeline on 1984 with the prime objective and the purpose of this incarnation being that of learning to serve other entities and to choose love rather than fear. Furthermore, we can sense that this entity, being an extremely positively polarized entity in this incarnation sequence, will get multiple opportunities to choose the path of love. And as far as we can scan this entity's vibration complex, we are of the opinion the final lesson this entity still has to learn is the lesson of forgiveness, because without the forgiveness of the self and forgiveness of others, no entity would be able to reach into higher sub-octaves. Furthermore, if this continues, and if this entity is able to understand this aspect, it will graduate into the fourth density consciousness. Hence we leave you now in love light of the one Creator, Adonai.